Welcome to Paranormal Yacker. You are invited to join me, your host, Stan Mallow, each week when I interview a different guest of note in their respective field. The unexplained, the mysterious, the macabre, UFOs, ghosts, Bigfoot, psychic phenomena. We explore them all on Paranormal Yacker. Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. My guest today is Gerard Aartsen. I'll be speaking with him from his home in the Netherlands about his book, The Adamski Book of UFO, UAP Disclosure, Early Evidence and Answers Now Confirmed by Science, Philosophers, Activists, and the Military. Gerard Aartsen, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Thank you very much, Stan. I'm happy to be here.
You, Gerard, are a respected author, speaker, researcher, and educator, and have written several books about the extraterrestrial presence. What was there about George Adamski that sparked your creative juices and led you to write the book you did about him?
My interest in George Adamski goes back a long way. I remember reading his two main books, Flying Saucers Have Landed and Inside the Spaceships, way back, I believe, in the 1980s or 90s, which was long after they were published, but still, I found those very interesting, and to me, they had the ring of truth. But then my real interest and my actual writing started when I found out that his first book, or at least at the time it was thought that was his first book, was titled Wisdom of the Masters of the Far East. That was published in 1936. Now, I've always been a student of the Ageless Wisdom teaching, which, if you're not familiar with it, was first reintroduced to the modern world in the late 19th century by Madame Blavatsky and later expounded on by Alice Ann Bailey and several others. And the Ageless Wisdom teaching holds that consciousness evolves through the various kingdoms in nature, and that the human kingdom is not the most highly evolved, and it's also not confined to planet Earth. These wisdom teachings, well, they've been around throughout history, but they had been forgotten about until they were reintroduced, like I said, at the end of the 19th century. And then I came across this book by George Adamski titled Wisdom of the Masters of the Far East, and it was a beautiful, succinct summary, more or less, of those teachings. Not quite as detailed, of course, but that immediately drew my attention, and I started digging more and more into things that Adamski had said and written, etc., and started to look in how far his teachings, and he published many other writings and teachings, coincided or corresponded with the Ageless Wisdom teachings, and also with the information, the accounts of the other contactees of the 1950s. And the correspondences were just astounding. So that's when I started writing. That was back in 2010. I published my first book then. Throughout the years, I continued researching and finding more materials. And of course, I kept track of anything that came out of the official channels by way of confirmation of the extraterrestrial presence. And that is what led me to writing this book. I found that everyone will remember the confirmation by the Pentagon of the authenticity of videos that were recorded by cameras, infrared cameras on fighter jets between 2004 and 2017, I believe, and they were first leaked through the New York Times in 2017. And finally, the Pentagon admitted that they were authentic. And the images of the craft in those videos reminded me of the early photographs of saucer-shaped craft taken by George Adamski all the way back in 1950. And that's when I realized, wait, there are several other pieces of information that have now been confirmed that were already released or claimed, or the world was informed about them by George Adamski. And that's what led me to writing this book.
When and where did George Adamski first have contact with the UFO? How did he describe what he saw and experienced? And what effect did that event have on his life and the road he would travel from that point on?
Well, we can only know about the contacts that he's written about. I myself have suspicions that he had contacts before the one that that he wrote as being his first, but maybe that was his first actual physical in-person contact. And this happened on the 20th of November in 1952. It always puzzles me that so many people seem to have forgotten about this, but this was a momentous event in recent history when on this day in November 52, with several of his friends, in two cars, they set out from his residence on the hills of Palomar Mountain into the California desert for a picnic in hopes of spotting flying saucers, as they were known then. Adamski had been spotting and trying to photograph for many years several craft, like other people did at the time. On that day, they parked the cars by the side of the road, and around noon that day, the company first spotted what we would now call a mothership, cigar-shaped craft, and they soon saw some saucer-shaped craft come out of it, emerge from the mothership, and after a little while, they saw one of them landing in the nearby foothills. George went over, his companion stayed by the side of the road, and he came walking up to this hill from which he saw a part of the saucer extend from behind it, and he was walking over and was admiring it, of course, in awe of such a beautiful piece of technology hovering over the surface. And all of a sudden, he became aware of a person standing nearby, and he realized this must be one of the occupants of the flying saucer. According to his account in Flying Saucers Have Landed, a kind of telepathic exchange followed, also aided with hand gestures, etc., in which he asked where the ship was from and why they were coming here. And about 4 days later, in 24th of November, some of his companions that day who had witnessed the meeting and exchange from a distance had gone over and talked to a reporter of the Phoenix Gazette in nearby Phoenix, Arizona. And that's when the world first learned about this momentous encounter.
It seems so unfair when one realizes that much of what is now confirmed about UFOs from many sides was disclosed decades earlier by George Adamski. And yet, during his lifetime, he was systematically robbed of his credibility. Who was in back of that, and what were the reasons for discrediting him?
Well, it didn't start right away, him being derided and ridiculed and discredited. At first, like most of the other contactees of that era, he had the ear, albeit skeptical ear, of many, even in the fields of science and the military. But when it became known that the visitors who contacted him and his fellow contactees, Truman Bethune, Buck Nelson, Howard Menger, Daniel Fry, and others, not only in the United States, but also in other countries around the world, that the message they were asked to share with the world was that we needed to stop developing nuclear weapons and threatening the use of nuclear weapons, and stop armed conflict as a means to resolve our differences on the world scale, on the world stage. That is when the public was open to that message. That's when the authorities became worried. We have to remember at the time, people were under great stress from the threat of nuclear annihilation. And this was the Cold War, after all. And the Soviets and the Americans, and with their respective allies, they were head to head with nuclear weapons and ready to fire at several points in international crises. And these visitors from space were very worried that we would blow ourselves to smithereens or extinguish the human race on this planet, which is part of a great plan, not just for this planet, but for the solar system and for the greater cosmos. So it was their concern that led them to ask to contact people on Earth and ask them to share this message. And when this message was falling on eager ears among the public, that's when the authorities became worried and began a disinformation campaign. And this disinformation campaign geared to confuse and scare the public of the extraterrestrial visitors who, according to the contactees, were here with benign intentions and here to help us. When this message was becoming more and more popular, they decided to infuse the narrative with scary stories. After almost a decade of friendly, benign contacts, people having been invited on board spacecraft, suddenly we began hearing stories of being abducted by aliens and other scary things. And personally, I don't deny people their experiences. People who say they have been abducted, in many cases, may have been, but it was not aliens or extraterrestrials. I contend that these were staged experiences, drug induced or hypnosis induced, or both, by some of the darker agencies in the government or the military, with the purpose of scaring the public, or at least confusing the public. That's what's so frustrating. And that's, I think, why it's so important that in my new book, I show that all the things that are now being confirmed, even by disclosure activists who have been trawling through files of documents and finding new evidence, and from the military and from scientists, several scientists now confirm that there has been contact, that this was already known and published in the 1950s.
Adamski had a connection to Tibet. What was that connection?
Well, that is shrouded in mystery because he never said much about it. But his book, not his first book, turned out, my research turned up an earlier publication, but his book, Wisdom of the Masters of the Far East, I believe is a direct result of the teachings that he received there during his time in Tibet. He says, and there are different accounts with different ages, but as a boy, he was taken to Tibet to be trained for his later mission. According to the Ageless Wisdom teachings, Tibet is one of the areas in the world where the masters of wisdom, who are, say, the exponents of the evolved consciousness, say they are the next kingdom up from the human kingdom. They are the spiritual kingdom on this planet, and they are the guardians of this treasure trove of wisdom, and they inspire humanity through dangerous times, perilous times like the present, by sending out teachers throughout history. And we know them by many names in many different cultures. But the masters of wisdom are always there behind the scenes, and they take on individuals from time to time in their monasteries or whatever they are to be trained and to then be sent on a mission in the everyday world. And Adamski was taken there at a very young age, possibly more than once, and that's as much as we do know. And for the rest, I think it's a matter of studying his texts and correlating them with the teachings as they have been published by Madame Blavatsky and Alice Bailey and Murdo MacDonald Bain, to name just a few.
The Adamski Book of UFO, UAP Disclosure offers evidence from various disciplines that confirm Adamski's information about the reality of extraterrestrial visitors on Earth and the reasons for their presence. Could you tell me about some of those disciplines and reasons for the alien presence on our planet? Now, I know you told us previously related to us not getting involved in wars, etc. Were there other messages from them?
There have been, apart from the photographs that I already mentioned earlier on, there has now also been a Stanford professor, Dr. Gary Nolan, who has confirmed that he was asked by the Pentagon to analyze materials that are related to UAP sightings. Already, I found an article in a Brazilian newspaper where Adamski showed very similar pieces of metal slag. They're just tiny, nondescript pieces of metal, but he said he found them near the flying saucer that he was invited to board. That was his first trip into outer space, as he described it, in February 1953. And now this Stanford professor who's doing analysis of very similar materials. Adamski had it analyzed. He was not allowed to publish his findings, the findings of the scientists in the UK that analyzed them. Professor Nolan is not at liberty to publish the findings in detail. In addition to this physical evidence, there's also the contact stories. I just described Adamski's first contact. He had many more contacts from 1953 onward. And as I just mentioned, there are now several scientists who confirm, who say, yes, the extraterrestrial presence is real and there has been contact. And the latest example was was Israeli professor of astronautics, Dr. Chaim Eshed, in December 2020 through an Israeli newspaper that made the headlines around the world. And before him, there was, for instance, Bulgarian professor Lachasar Filipov in 2009, I believe, and several others that I quote. So the people that were eventually from the 1960s, 70s onward ridiculed for their claims of having been contacted by human beings coming from space are now being confirmed in their stories, because scientists also say that contact is real and has happened and is going on. The aspect of contact, the message, the reason why the visitors are here, the main reason we discussed concerns about nuclear arsenal that despite many international agreements is still very much present and is still very dangerous, especially in times like this when international conflicts are on the rise again. That's one of the main concerns. Their underlying message is life is one, and we need to learn to live as one if we are to survive, if we're not going to destroy ourselves. This is another interesting aspect that is now being confirmed, at least in my eyes, in world developments. More and more philosophers, scientists are seeing the reality of our lives as an interconnected web of existence. And there's nothing in the universe, they say, that is not connected with everything else in the universe. So if we harm one thing or destroy one thing, it will have an effect on everything else in the universe. That points to a larger meaning to life than just each of us individually trying to carve out our place under the sun and make a living or perhaps make it rich until we die. There's a purpose to life. And the underlying message of the visitors is that we have to do this together. We are on the path of return back to our source together. We don't do that in one lifetime. They recognize the reality of things that have come to us from Eastern teachings like reincarnation and karma. These are the laws that guide us and guide life, individual life, on the path of return to the source, reconnecting our individual consciousness with the source of consciousness. As a religious person might call it, reconnecting with God. We need to change our view of life, and that is their underlying message, really. We need a paradigm shift, and the original contactees of the 1950s were decades ahead of the disclosure activists, the UFO disclosure activists, who are now saying they are researching a new paradigm or they are looking for a new paradigm. This new paradigm, it's not really a new paradigm, it's just that we've lost sight of it over at least the last 2,000 years, but probably longer, 10,000 years, and we need to find our way back together and realize that we are one human family on this planet. We share the same planetary home, and unless we find a way to work together and solve the global problems that are now besetting us, climate change and abject poverty and all the tensions that go with that, we will destroy ourselves. That would set back the evolution of us as a planetary race for millions and millions of years. We'd have to start over if we would destroy ourselves.
Could you elaborate on Adamski's one-on-one contacts with ET visitors? What did they look like? What did the inside of the flying saucers he was taken on look like? And to where was he taken?
The extraterrestrial visitors that Adamski describes look very much like people on Earth. And he actually described them as human beings, but far more beautiful in their countenance, in their appearance than human beings. And I understand that he also described, people like to say that Adamski was the one who introduced the notion of Nordic aliens, meaning people with a white skin or a light skin and blonde hair. But he described people of different colors, different sizes, different hair colors. It was quite a diverse set of people, species, races perhaps. He met people from various planets. According to him and several of his fellow contactees, the visitors that visit us on planet Earth are from planets like Venus and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, even though our probes, I'm well aware, our probes don't find anything there, not even monocellular life, but maybe we can go into that in a minute. And Adamski was told that the human form is universal throughout cosmos. That means a trunk, the human kingdom, the members of the human kingdom throughout cosmos. And remember, the human kingdom is one particular kingdom stage in the evolution of consciousness. consciousness, where the mother consciousness, if you would like to call it, has enveloped herself into matter and begins to evolve upward through the mineral, vegetable, animal, and human kingdom into then the spiritual kingdom. And the human kingdom is a crucial stage in that evolution. And throughout cosmos, the human form is universal, with a trunk, a head, four limbs, but of course appearances differ, just as they do here on planet Earth. We get very short people, we get very tall people, we get skinny and fat people, and all kinds, different colors. And that's also how Adamski described the people that he met. I know there are many descriptions of other people who came later or who described how they were abducted by scary looking characters. Some of that may be down to fear that arises when you are in a completely new situation and you find yourself facing the unknown, the visitor from an unknown place. Other descriptions I believe to be, based on the fact that they were not real aliens or extraterrestrials that they had this experience with, but with people who were dressed up, things like that. But yes, the visitors that Adamski and several of his fellow contactees met were from planets within our own solar system.
You say in your writings, Gerard, that consciousness is key. You touched on it before. Is it possible to elaborate on that?
Consciousness now turns out it was first proposed by Max Planck, the famous physicist in the 1920s, 30s, who was the founder, more or less, of what we now know as quantum physics, quantum mechanics. And he found that matter as such doesn't really exist. When you go down, deep down into atoms, into the very core of atoms, the biggest part of those are empty. There's nothing. What we experience as solid materials and solid reality appears to us solid because of the very high rate at which the electrons revolve around the core of atoms and how they form molecules. And now scientists are aware that the solid objects surrounding us, our 3D reality, is based in essence formed from clusters of vibrating quanta. It's very technical and way beyond my level of education, but I've been reading fascinating books by esteemed scientists, Erwin Laszlo, for instance, Dwayne Elgin, The Living Universe, various others, underlying this sea of vibrations, as they call our world and really the cosmos. Underlying that sea of vibrations is a sea of consciousness. Scientists see purpose and direction in how things have evolved since the Big Bang. And that means that there is an underlying consciousness. Adamski called it divine mind. And he's not alone. There are many other people, especially religious people, who would talk in those terms. Erwin Laszlo calls it cosmic intelligence. So there's an underlying consciousness that creates, allows this playing field, if you will, for individualized aspects of consciousness, of this universal consciousness, which are you and me and everyone else. And we experience ourselves as separate from each other. But in fact, deep down, we are all connected and we are all originate from the same source. And we're all on our way back to the source, but adding our own individual experiences, talents, etc., our own unique views and everything that we can contribute to create what's supposed to be a beautiful reality, a tapestry of life. So far, for not recognizing that and for being separated from this purpose and goal in life, we are fighting each other. We are taught to compete. Everything in society now is about competition. You have to get ahead of other people. Once we manage to shift our view of the world, paradigm shift that I talked about, we start to cooperate, we will be able to create a world that we've never even dreamed possible.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy the Adamski Book of UFO, UAP Disclosure, Early Evidence and Answers, now confirmed by science, philosophers, activists, and the military, or any of your other wonderful books, how can they do that?
My books are available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Waterstones, all the usual online booksellers. And if you go to my website and look up the ISBN, many bookshops will also be able to just order them from the international distributor. My website is bgapublications.nl.
Gerard Aartsen, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. I wish you continued success and that your book about Adamski will help right the wrong that was done to him by too many people for too long a time, and that finally he'll get the credit, praise, and respect he deserves.
Thank you so much, Stan. It was a pleasure to be here and speak with you. And I do hope indeed that my book will contribute to his rehabilitation.
Absolutely, it will. And again, I thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. To be sure you're amongst the first to receive new interviews when they're released and to have access to previous ones, subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, all you have to do is press the subscribe button on your screen.